Hi, I'm Scott Koch. I'm with Landlord to Legacy, and I'm sitting here today with Mr. Chambers. He has changed my life. So he's got a story about the beginnings, about children and investments and how they can go together. All right, Mr. Chambers. So we met at Weeby's for the first time ever. And you told me a story that actually brought tears to my eyes because it was relevant to me and my situation. So that story was about your grandma Fike.
That's right.
So if you could please retell that story in all of its glory, the way that you told it that day, about how you came to be. I think that a lot of people could benefit from that story.
Yes, I grew up in the country in South Missouri, and I was kind of an accident along toward the end of my mother's fertility. She was almost 40 years old, and I found out later that she had come from a family of 13 children. And my grandma and grandpa Fike were farmers, and whenever they had about 6 children, they were living in a little ramshackle house, and they were doing farming kind of on the shares, you know. And she was so poor, she was.
So what do you mean on the shares? They didn't own the land?
They didn't own the land.
Okay,
no.
all right.
They were just doing all the work on it.
Okay.
And they were taking part of the produce, you know. And so she had told my grandpa Fike that they couldn't have any more children because they were too poor. And she was feeling sorry for herself, and so she was out in the garden one day, she told me, as she was hoeing in the garden and talking to the Lord. And she said she had the craziest idea. And she walked into the house because my grandpa was in there doing some carpentry work in the back end of the house. And so she yelled and she said, "Oh, Douglas." And he said, "Yes, Danny." And she said, "Come into the kitchen here. I've got something I want to tell you." And so he came into the kitchen and he laid his hammer down and he said, "What is it?" And she says, "I was out in the garden talking to the Lord." And she says, "I've got something to tell you, Douglas." She says, "We only live one time." Now there's a significant statement.
That is a significant statement.
And she
so
says,
he didn't want to have any kids, though, right? They had 6 already.
They had 6 already.
They didn't own the land.
And they were afraid that they were so poor that they couldn't afford any more kids. So she was out there and she said, "We only live one time." And she says, "Douglas," she says, "this is what the Lord kind of showed me out in the garden." She said, "There's nothing in the whole world that I love any more than babies." And she said, "If you're willing," she said, "I would like to have just as many babies as I can have." And of course, you know, that's crazy, but they started having more babies, and I'm glad they did because my mama, I think, was number 10, and I wouldn't even be here if it hadn't been for that. And so anyway, I was born whenever my mama was almost 40 years old. And so I was a little tiny tyke whenever, and anyway, I still remember growing up, though, that the wealthiest family in the whole community was the Fike family.
The family that was working shares on a farm they didn't own, that had how many kids altogether?
They had 6 then, and they went ahead and started having children.
When they were done, how many kids did they have?
They had 13.
13 kids.
They had 13 children. And I was one of the little afterthoughts whenever you know, when my mama was in anyway, and when I was growing up, it was well known in the whole community that they were the wealthiest family in the whole country. They gave a farm to each one of their 13 children.
Grandma Fike gave a farm to each one of her kids.
Grandma and Grandpa, yes, gave a farm to each one of the 13 children. They gave the Reuben place to my mama Bessie. And they gave a farm to, and it was bottom land, which was good land, you know, and they were wealthy. And how can you explain that, Scott, any other way besides the Lord intervening? And he said we're supposed to be fruitful and we're supposed to multiply and we're supposed to fill the earth. Well, that's what they did. And I remember whenever I was about 6 or 7 years old. Now this was a long time ago. My goodness, that was about 70 years ago now. I went over to Grandma Fike's house, and she said, "Oh yes, we've got to go to Lebanon. I've got to turn in a CD, a certificate of deposit, you know, to renew it." And I said, well, how much is it for? And she said, oh, it's only $5,000, she said. Now, $5,000 back 70 years ago was worth a lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
So there is no explanation for it. I had an uncle, Uncle Clifford, once that I was questioning about it. And he kind of laughed and he kind of joked and he said, yeah, there were 9 boys in the family. He said, if you had 9 slaves working for you, he said you can have them working on the farm and they could. But anyway, I think the Lord is the one that's involved.
So how did they go from working shares to owning farms?
I don't have any explanation for it.
Huh.
There's no explanation for what the Lord does.
Hmm.
There's no explanation for it. That's the same thing as what I told you about me. I went to college, and when I got out of college, all I had was a student loan. Now I'm a millionaire.
Which is the student loan is where a lot of people are sitting right now.
Because that was money that I borrowed. I had to borrow the money to go to college on.
Sure.
So I didn't start out with.
So what advice would you give to somebody who's sitting there right now with a student loan and thinking about having children and saying, I can't have any kids because I only have debt?
They better think again.
How do kids and investments go together?
I have no idea. I just know that the Lord said in Genesis, the 2nd chapter, that we humans were supposed to multiply.
Right.
We were supposed to be fruitful.
Yeah.
And we were supposed to multiply, and we were supposed to fill the earth.
Yeah. You tell me something all the time. You say you have no idea because why?
Because I started admitting to the Lord how stupid I was.
There you go.
Whenever I was in high school, I was the valedictorian of my class.
Mm-hmm.
And all the time that I thought that I was smart, I was very unsuccessful.
Mm-hmm.
I finally came to Alaska. Oh, I guess I came to Anchorage in '74 with my cousin invited me to come up.
We're going to talk about him too.
We're going to talk about him too. Mm-hmm. He's a Pike,
mm-hmm.
by the way. And so I was kind of at the end of myself one night, and I was reading in the Bible, and it says, Luke 6:38 says, give and it'll be given unto you.
Mm-hmm.
Good measure,
mm-hmm.
pressed down,
mm-hmm.
shaken together, and running over will men bring into your bosom. For with the same measure you mete out, it'll be returned again unto you. And I thought to myself, my goodness, what a promise. And you would think this was sacrilegious probably, but I looked up at the ceiling whenever I read that, and I said, all right, buddy. Most people would think that was an awful way to talk to the Lord, but I said, I'm going to take you up on that. And then I did something that was intelligent for a change. I asked him, I said, okay, what should I do? And out of the clear blue, it came to me that my cousin that I was living with had a house across the street on Nelchina Street.
Mm-hmm.
And the woman had left it in a mess, and he was redoing the kitchen, and he was redoing the sheetrock, and there was and he was a pilot for Alaska Airlines,
mm-hmm.
so he wasn't there all the time. And the idea came to me that I was teaching then over at Service High School, and that I should come home after school, which would be about 2:30, and that I should work with my cousin until supper time.
Thank you.
All right.